in this moment, come as you are. I'm Nick, and you are welcome here. A mind that longs for rest, a body in need of deep sleep tonight. We will share hours of dark stories centered on mystery and the strange comfort that comes from embracing the unknown. As you listen, let go of the day and the weight you have been carrying around. Just a handful of ads in the first 10 minutes, then completely ad-free for hours so nothing wakes you up. If you would like to make this your place for rest, please subscribe and hit like. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from. Let us begin right now. The call came at 2:41. Julian Prescott woke to his phone vibrating across the nightstand, the screen casting blue light across walls he'd painted himself 6 months prior. Accessible beige, the label had said, though in darkness it looked like nothing at all. Detective Miller's voice, no preamble. Garrick had breached the secure wing 40 minutes ago. Miller was 8 minutes out. Julian sat up. The sheets were expensive, high thread count. The kind of purchase that had felt like a small victory after the trial, Egyptian cotton against skin that had gone very cold. He asked how. Miller told him to get dressed. Jeans, boots, layers, and bring nothing digital. The line went dead. Julian dressed in darkness, muscle memory from childhood mornings, before his mother woke. Jeans, thermal shirt, fleece pullover, hiking boots he'd bought for a camping trip he'd never taken. His hands shook, fastening the laces. He gripped his knees until the tremor stopped. Randall Garrick, the oubliette killer. 14 confirmed victims over 9 years. Maybe more they'd never found. People plucked from parking lots, jogging trails, late-night shifts. Vanished so completely their families still posted anniversary remembrances on Facebook, still renewed missing persons websites, still called Julian's office asking if there had been developments. The evidence had been circumstantial but overwhelming. Garrick's storage unit, the soundproofing materials, receipts for industrial locks, the psychiatric evaluation revealing a man whose conception of other people as real had been surgically removed sometime in childhood. Julian had delivered the closing argument that put Garrick in Supermax for life. The jury had deliberated 90 minutes. That had been 14 months ago. Headlights swept Julian's living room. He looked out through the blinds, an unmarked sedan, Miller's outline visible in the driver's seat. Julian grabbed his wallet and keys, left his phone on the kitchen counter, screen down, suddenly aware of how much of his life existed inside that small glass rectangle. The stairwell smelled like someone's late-night cooking. Garlic and something burned. Julian took the stairs 2 at a time. His building had security cameras in the lobby. They'd see him leave. Good. Let there be a record of the last time anyone saw Julian Prescott walking out of his own life. Miller pushed open the passenger door as Julian reached the curb. The interior of the sedan smelled like coffee that had been reheated too many times. Julian asked where they were going as he slid into the seat. The door closed with the heavy sound of reinforced metal. Miller's answer? Somewhere Garrick wouldn't find him. A safe house off-grid, used for witness protection relocations. He pulled into traffic. No sirens, no urgency visible from outside. Just 2 men driving through Baltimore at 3 in the morning. Julian asked how Garrick had gotten out. Guard rotation, Miller explained. Someone turned a corner 30 seconds late. Garrick had used a handcuff key. Homemade. The kind you could make from a cigarette lighter if you knew what you were doing. Garrick didn't smoke, Julian said. Miller's jaw works. Someone had given it to him. They were looking into it. Then he mentioned the note Garrick had left in his cell. Julian's name, his address. His mother's nursing home in Towson. Julian's throat closed. Miller assured him quickly that she was safe, moved 2 hours ago. But Garrick had possessed that information. He'd been planning this. The highway was empty enough that Julian could see the seams in the pavement, the regular rhythm of streetlights creating strobed intervals of visibility. Miller drove exactly the speed limit. Hands at 10 and 2. They'd worked together for 7 months building the case against Garrick. Miller had been the one to find the storage unit, obtain the warrant, photograph the soundproofing materials stacked against cinder block walls. Miller had sat beside Julian during the trial, feeding him details about crime scene protocols, chain of custody documentation. Miller had testified for 3 days, unshakable, under cross-examination. Miller had also been the one to identify Garrick in the first place. A traffic stop for expired tags. The kind of random intersection between law enforcement and civilian life that happened 10,000 times a day in Baltimore. But Miller had noticed something in Garrick's eyes during the document check. Something absent. He'd run the plates, found the storage unit lease, obtained surveillance footage from nearby businesses. Julian had asked him once what he'd seen in Garrick's eyes that day. Miller had taken a long time answering. Then he'd said some people looked at you like you were furniture, like you were part of the landscape they had to navigate around. Garrick had looked at Miller like Miller was a photograph, two-dimensional, already forgotten. That conversation had been in Julian's office 8 months ago. Miller had been eating Chinese takeout, spare ribs that left grease spots on the case files. Julian remembered because he'd had to reprint the fingerprint analysis after Miller set his carton down on it. Now Miller exited the highway onto a rural route Julian didn't recognize. Trees pressed close to the asphalt. No streetlights. The sedan's headlights carved a tunnel through darkness that closed behind them like water. They drove for 40 minutes. Miller said nothing. Julian watched the odometer, the clock on the dashboard, the temperature display dropping degree by degree as they climbed into the Appalachian foothills. Finally, Miller turned onto a gravel road marked only by a faded Park Service sign. The sedan bounced over ruts. Branches scraped the roof. Julian's molars ached from clenching. The gravel road ended at a concrete structure that looked like an abandoned ranger station. Squat, utilitarian, windows dark. Miller killed the engine. Miller explained as they got out, the ranger station was a shell. The real facility was below. Built during the Cold War, updated 15 years ago, completely off-grid. Solar and backup generators, 6 months of supplies, communications ran through a dedicated satellite uplink. No one could find Julian here unless they already knew the location existed. Miller unlocked the ranger station's front door with a key that looked new. Inside smelled like must and rodent dropping. Miller led Julian to what had been a supply closet. He pulled aside a shelving unit mounted on wheels. Behind it, a steel door with a biometric scanner. Miller pressed his thumb to the scanner. Something deep in the mechanism clicked. The door swung inward on counterweights, revealing a stairwell descending into fluorescent light. Julian followed Miller down. 43 steps. Julian counted. The walls were poured concrete, smooth and cold. The fluorescent tubes hummed at a frequency Julian could feel in his back teeth. At the bottom, another steel door. This one required a key code. Miller's fingers moved across the panel too quickly for Julian to follow. 6 digits, maybe 8. The door unsealed with a pneumatic hiss. The facility beyond was larger than Julian had expected. A central corridor branched into multiple rooms. LED lighting strips along the baseboards cast everything in shadowless white. The air tasted recycled. Temperature exactly 71 degrees. Miller gave him the tour. Living quarters. 2 bedrooms, bathroom with shower, kitchenette stocked with freeze-dried meals and canned goods, communications room with satellite phone and encrypted data terminal. Medical supplies in a locker that would have been adequate for field surgery Recreation area with treadmill, weights, shelves of books still in their protective plastic. And at the far end of the corridor, past all the livable spaces, a room Miller identified as secure storage. The door was different from the others, thicker. The kind of vault door Julian associated with bank repositories. A manual wheel lock in the center, pneumatic seals along the edges. Miller explained the secure storage held backup equipment, emergency rations, redundant communication gear. He didn't open it. Julian studied the vault door, the seals, the thickness of the steel. He looked back down the corridor they'd walked, measured distances with his eyes, thought about the layout. The living quarters were clustered, the communication room adjacent to the kitchenette. But the secure storage vault sat isolated at the corridor's end, separated, self-contained, like something designed to hold a person. Julian's pulse became visible in his throat. He touched the concrete wall beside the vault door. It was colder than it should have been, the kind of cold that came from being buried deep, insulated from any warmth the surface world could offer. Miller was watching him. Julian pulled his hand back. Miller showed him how to lock the main entrance from inside. The biometric scanner worked both directions. Miller's thumbprint would unseal the facility when backup arrived, when Garrick had been recaptured, when it was safe for Julian to return to his life. How long would that take, Julian asked. Miller didn't know. Days, maybe. A week at most. Garrick had no resources, no allies. He was a psychiatric patient with limited survival skills. The marshals would find him. Julian nodded. He was still thinking about the vault door, the way it sat at the corridor's end like punctuation. Miller made coffee in the kitchenette. The machine was new, expensive, the kind that ground beans fresh for each cup. Steam rose from 2 mugs Miller set on the counter. He'd brought cream, the real kind, in a small cooler. They sat in the recreation area. Miller drank his coffee black. Julian added cream and watched it spiral. Miller talked about the case, reminded Julian of details as though Julian could have forgotten. Garrick's apartment, nearly empty and nothing on the walls. The storage unit, with its soundproofing and locks. The victims' families in the courtroom gallery, watching Garrick's face for some flicker of recognition, of remorse. Julian had noticed during the trial how Garrick looked at the families, the same way Miller said Garrick had looked at him during the traffic stop, like they were photographs, already archived. Miller set his empty mug down. He asked if Julian remembered the first victim, the one they'd never connected to Garrick officially because the evidence was circumstantial even by their case's standards. Julian did remember. Garrett Lowry. Disappeared 11 years ago from a grocery store parking lot in Bethesda. 28 years old, investment analyst, engaged. His fiancée had found his car with the groceries still in the trunk, ice cream melted into the upholstery. Miller nodded. He'd always believed that was Garrick's first. The one where Garrick learned what he was capable of. The one that taught him how thoroughly a person could be erased. Julian's coffee had gone cold. He set the mug down carefully. Miller stood. He said he needed to check the communications uplink, make sure the satellite connection was stable. He left Julian in the recreation area. Julian waited until Miller's footsteps faded. Then he stood and walked back down the corridor to the vault door. He studied it closely now. The manual wheel lock was polished, recently oiled. The pneumatic seals looked new, replaced within the last year. The door itself was rated for blast containment. He'd seen doors like this before in his prosecutor days, visiting federal evidence facilities. But those doors had been designed to keep people out. This door, Julian realized, was designed to keep someone in. The seals ran along every edge. The ventilation grill mounted high on the adjacent wall would allow air circulation, but nothing larger than a hand. The door's thickness, 8 inches at least. would make any sound from inside inaudible beyond a few feet. Julian pressed his ear to the cold steel. Listen. Nothing. Just his own pulse in his skull. He pulled back and looked down the corridor. Miller was still in the communications room, out of sight. Julian could hear him moving equipment, testing connections. Julian walked back to the communications room and stood in the doorway. Miller was bent over the satellite terminal, checking cable connections. He glanced up when Julian's shadow crossed the threshold. Julian asked about the vault door. What was actually stored there? Miller straightened. He explained again. Redundant equipment, emergency supplies, things they'd need if the primary systems fail. Why the vault-grade security, Julian pressed. For supplies. Miller's expression didn't change. He said the facility had originally been built for Cold War contingencies. High-value target protection. The vault had been designed for classified documents, encryption equipment. They'd kept the original architecture when updating the facility because changing it would have cost more than leaving it intact. Julian nodded. Reasonable. Budgets and bureaucracy? The kind of answer that fit. Except, Julian thought about the layout again. The way the livable spaces clustered together while the vault sat isolated. The new seals on a supposedly unchanged Cold War relic. The polished wheel locks. He thought about Miller finding Garrick during a routine traffic stop. The odds of that. The randomness. He thought about Garrett Lowry. Disappeared from a parking lot 11 years ago. Investment analyst. Engaged. Miller was still watching him. Julian asked if he could see inside the vault. Just to know what resources they had if something went wrong. Miller hesitated. Then he said the vault required a separate access code, one he'd have to retrieve from the communications log. He'd open it tomorrow once they'd settled in, confirm the facility was secure. Julian said that was fine. Miller seemed to relax. He suggested Julian get some rest. The bedroom on the left had fresh linens. There were toiletries in the bathroom. Miller would take first watch, monitor the communications in case there were updates about Garrick. Julian agreed. He walked to the bedroom Miller had indicated, closed the door, sat on the bed with its taut military corners. He could hear Miller in the corridor. Footsteps. The sound of the communications room door closing. Julian waited 20 minutes. Then he stood and opened his bedroom door slowly. The corridor was empty. The communications room door was shut, a line of light visible beneath it. Julian walked silently to the vault door. He examined the wheel lock more closely. It was a 6-spoke design, each spoke positioned at precise 60-degree intervals, the kind of lock that required specific rotational sequences. Right, left, right, to align internal pins. But there was something else, a secondary mechanism. Julian knelt and looked at the base of the door where it met the floor. There, nearly invisible, unless you were looking for it, a hydraulic control panel, recessed into the concrete, cover flush with the floor. Julian used his thumbnail to pry up the cover. Beneath it, a keypad. 12 buttons, numbers 0 through 9, plus 2 unmarked keys. This wasn't Cold War architecture. This was new, installed recently, within the last year, maybe less. Julian heard movement from the communications room. He lowered the hydraulic panel cover and stood. He was back in his bedroom with the door closed before Miller emerged into the corridor. Julian lay on the bed, fully clothed, listened to Miller's footsteps pause outside his door. A long silence. Then Miller continued to the other bedroom. Julian waited until he heard Miller's door close. Then he waited another hour. The facility's ventilation system created a steady white noise. No other sounds penetrated it. They could have been the only 2 people left on Earth. Finally, Julian stood. He opened his door a crack. The corridor was dark now, except for the emergency lighting strips along the baseboards. Miller's door was closed. Julian moved down the corridor to the communications room. Tried the handle. Locked. He went to the kitchenette instead. Opened the drawers quietly until he found what he needed. A paring knife, narrow-bladed, sharp. He returned to the communications room door. The lock was standard commercial hardware. Pin and tumbler. Julian had prosecuted enough burglary cases to understand the basic mechanics. He worked the knife blade into the gap between door and frame, feeling for the latch. It took 4 minutes. The latch gave. The door opened. The communications room was smaller than Julian remembered from the tour. The satellite terminal occupied most of one wall, its screen dark. Cable runs disappeared into conduits that led upward, presumably to the surface antenna array. Julian examined the cables, followed them to their connection points. Found what he was looking for behind the terminal, a junction box where all the communication lines converged before routing topside. The box had been opened recently. Julian could see where the screws had been removed and replaced, the threads showing fresh metal. He opened it again. Inside, every cable had been cut. Clean cuts, made with proper tools. Not damage, not malfunction. Deliberate severance. The cuts were concealed behind reconnected housing, cosmetic only. Anyone testing the terminal from inside the facility would see normal indicator lights, normal interface responses. But no signal would reach the satellite. No communication could leave this bunker. Julian closed the junction box. His hands were steady now. He left the communications room and walked to the main entrance. Examined the biometric scanner. It was a newer model, the kind with redundant backup systems. But Julian noticed something. The scanner's internal LED, visible through the smoked plastic housing, was amber instead of green. Amber meant standby mode. The scanner wasn't actively reading. It was displaying a recorded state. Julian pressed his thumb to the scanner. Nothing happened. He tried again. The LED stayed amber. Miller's thumbprint wouldn't open this door either. The entrance had been sealed from outside after they'd entered. The biometric scanner wasn't reading anything anymore. It was just displaying a simulation of functionality. Julian walked back down the corridor, past the living quarters, stopped at the vault door. He knelt and opened the hydraulic panel cover again, studied the keypad. Thought about Garrett Lowry, investment analyst, 28. Disappeared 11 years ago. Julian tried 0428. Lowry's age at disappearance. Nothing. He tried 1102. November 2nd. The date Lowry had vanished. Nothing. He tried 1113. 11 years, 13 days. The exact time between Lowry's disappearance and Garrick's arrest. Nothing. The keypad didn't respond to any input. No error tones, no LED feedback. Just inert buttons. Julian closed the panel and stood. He looked at the wheel lock. 6 spokes. 60-degree intervals. He gripped one spoke and turned right. The wheel moved freely, no resistance. He turned it a full rotation. 2 rotations, nothing engaged. He tried turning left. Same result. The wheel spun without catching. The lock was cosmetic, like the biometric scanner, like the communications terminal. All simulation, all theater. Julian heard Miller's footsteps in the corridor. He stepped back from the vault door. Miller emerged from the communications room carrying a clipboard. He saw Julian standing by the vault and paused. Julian said he'd been curious about the storage. Miller's expression remained pleasant. He'd open it later, after the next scheduled check-in. Protocol required maintaining certain priorities. Julian nodded. He asked when the next check-in was scheduled. Miller consulted the clipboard. 1800 hours. 6 p.m. Julian checked his watch. 11:23. 6.5 hours. He said he'd wait. Miller seemed satisfied. He suggested lunch around noon. There were MREs in the kitchenette. various entrees, some better than others. At noon, Miller prepared beef stew for himself, chicken, and rice for Julian. They heated in boiling water, the pouches swelling. Steam rose when Miller opened them. The smell was sharp and faintly rotten at once. They ate without speaking. Miller had stopped making conversation. The pretense of normalcy was thinning. After lunch, Miller said he needed to perform maintenance on the backup generator. It was located in a service corridor, accessed through the secure storage vault. He'd be occupied for several hours. Julian's pulse jumped. Miller was going to open the vault. Miller stood and walked to the vault door. Julian followed, trying to appear casual. Miller knelt at the hydraulic panel. His body blocked Julian's view of the keypad. His fingers moved. Julian counted the tones. 8 tones. An 8-digit code. The hydraulic locks disengaged with a sound like a sigh. Miller gripped the wheel lock and turned it. This time it caught. He rotated it through a specific sequence. Right, left, right, counting rotations under his breath. The vault door unsealed, pneumatic hiss. Miller pulled it open. Beyond was darkness. Miller reached inside and found a light switch. Fluorescent tubes flickered on. The vault wasn't storage, it was a room. 12 feet by 12 feet. Bare concrete walls. A cot against one wall, military style. Sheets still wrapped in plastic. A camp toilet in the corner. A shelf with bottled water and freeze-dried meals. A ventilation grill in the ceiling, small, barely adequate. And nothing else. No backup equipment. No emergency supplies. No generator access corridor. Just a cell. Soundproof. Airtight except for minimal ventilation. Completely isolated from the rest of the facility. Miller stood in the doorway, no longer blocking Julian's view. He was done pretending. Julian's voice, when he spoke, was steady. He asked what this was. Miller turned to face him. His expression had changed. The pleasant professional mask had fallen away. What remained was something Julian had seen before, in courtrooms and police interrogation rooms. The face of someone who'd stopped performing humanity. "You convicted the wrong man," Miller said. Julian's stomach dropped. Miller continued. Randall Garrick was exactly what his psychiatric evaluation claimed. A broken person, delusional, obsessed with news coverage of the oubliette disappearances. He'd collected articles, created elaborate theories, inserted himself into the narrative so thoroughly he'd half convinced himself he was responsible. But Garrick had never taken anyone. He'd bought the soundproofing materials, yes, but for his apartment. He couldn't tolerate noise. He'd leased the storage unit, yes, but it contained nothing but his hoarded newspapers and recordings of police scanner traffic. The real evidence, the locations of the bodies, the specific methodology, the psychological signature, none of it had actually connected to Garrick. Miller had created those connections, planted the receipts, fabricated the chain of custody, testified with complete confidence because he knew exactly how the victims had been taken. Miller had taken them. Julian's back hit the corridor wall. He hadn't realized he'd been moving away. His voice, when it came out, was barely a whisper. He asked why. Why him specifically? Miller kept talking, his voice calm, almost pedagogical. He explained how he'd needed someone to blame. The case had gone cold. The department was being pressured. Families were threatening lawsuits. Miller had found Garrick during a traffic stop and recognized immediately what Garrick was. Perfect. Mentally ill. Obsessed with the crimes. Friendless. No alibi for any of the disappearances because he never left his apartment. Julian's hands were shaking. He pressed them against the wall behind him. Asked how Miller had done it. How he'd made it stick. Miller seemed pleased by the question. He explained the timing. Entering Garrick's storage unit during the initial warrant execution, alone for 7 minutes, while his partner secured the perimeter. Plenty of time to add a few items to Garrick's existing hoard. Receipts for materials Miller had purchased years ago, aged with careful handling, marked with dates that predated the disappearances. Tools Miller had used himself, wiped clean, and then pressed into Garrick's hand during the arrest, transferring prints. Chain of custody, documented with perfect precision because Miller controlled the evidence log. Julian asked about the storage unit itself, why Garrick had rented it. Miller said Garrick had needed somewhere for his newspapers, his police scanner recordings. The man collected information about the oubliette cases obsessively. Miller had simply leveraged that obsession, made it look like documentation of his own crimes rather than fixation on someone else's. And Julian, Miller said, had prosecuted it brilliantly. The closing argument had been particularly effective. The jury had believed every word. Julian slid down the wall until he was sitting on the concrete floor. He asked what this place was, what Miller wanted. Miller said he'd always planned to create one final oubliette, his masterpiece, completely off-grid, unreachable. A place where someone could scream for years and never be heard. He'd spent 14 months building it, funding it with money he'd accumulated over years, victims' bank accounts accessed before they disappeared, drained gradually through identity theft. Lowry's investment portfolio alone had yielded enough for the initial excavation. This facility was registered nowhere. The property records showed only the abandoned ranger station. The construction had been done by contractors who believed they were building a prepper bunker for a paranoid millionaire. Different contractors for different phases. None of them saw the whole picture. And then Miller had needed someone to put in it. Someone whose disappearance would be explained. Someone who'd been threatened. Someone the oubliette killer had reason to target. Julian's voice cracked when he asked the question again. Why him? Out of everyone Miller could have chosen. Miller's expression shifted. Something surfaced behind his eyes, old, hungry. He said Julian had been the prosecutor. Julian had stood in court and described the oubliette killer's methodology. With such precise understanding, it had been almost beautiful. Julian had understood what the oubliettes meant. The complete erasure. The absolute silence. Miller wanted Julian to experience what he'd described so eloquently. Julian's legs wouldn't hold him. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the concrete floor. Miller walked to the communications room. Returned with a small black duffel bag. He unzipped it and removed a syringe, pre-filled. He explained it was a sedative, veterinary grade. Julian would wake up in the vault. The door would be sealed. Miller would leave through the surface entrance and trigger the final lockdown remotely. After that, Julian could scream all he wanted. He could throw himself against the door. He could try to dig through 8 inches of steel with his fingernails. No one would hear. No one would come. The facility didn't exist on any map. The ranger station above would collapse under scheduled demolition in 6 weeks. The entrance would be buried under rubble and regrowth. Julian would have water, food for months. He wouldn't die quickly. He'd have time to think about Garrett Lowry, about the other 13, about Randall Garrick and Supermax serving life for crimes he didn't commit. Miller approached with the syringe. Julian tried to stand. His muscles wouldn't respond. Shock had locked his body. Miller knelt beside him. His free hand gripped Julian's shoulder with professional gentleness, the kind of touch meant to calm a panicking animal. Julian closed his eyes, then opened them, and looked at Miller with an expression Miller had never seen from him before. Cold, flat. The mask Julian had been wearing for 14 months finally falling away. "The vault won't open," Julian said. Miller froze. Julian continued, his voice steady now, almost clinical. He said the hydraulic panel keypad was locked, biometrically, to Julian's thumbprint. Miller could enter the code all he wanted. The door would never unseal again without Julian's living hand. Miller's grip on Julian's shoulder tightened. He said that was impossible. He'd tested every system. The vault operated on the code alone. Julian shook his head. He explained that 3 months ago, while Miller had been occupied with his contracting schedules and his elaborate theater, Julian had accessed this facility. Julian had used his own government clearance, higher than Miller realized, to identify the construction site, to enter at night, to modify the vault's hydraulic controls. Miller started to speak. Julian talked over him. Julian said he'd known Miller was the real oubliette killer for 11 months, since February, since Julian had reviewed the original case files and noticed something no one else had caught. Miller's initial report from Garrett Lowry's disappearance scene had included details no responding officer could have known. Specifics about Lowry's routine, the grocery store he preferred, the exact parking space Lowry used. Details only someone who'd been watching Lowry would know. Julian had checked the other disappearances, found similar anomalies. Miller present at scenes too quickly, knowing too much, offering leads that were too specific. So Julian had built a parallel investigation, quietly, alone. He'd traced the storage unit leased to a shell company, followed that to a property trust, found this bunker, and he'd waited. Because convicting Miller wouldn't be enough. Miller was too careful, too protected by his badge. The evidence Julian had was circumstantial. A good defense attorney would shred it. So Julian had needed Miller to bring him here, to confess, to reveal everything. Julian reached into his jacket pocket, removed a small device, audio recorder, running the entire time. Miller stared at it. The syringe fell from his hand. Julian stood. He was steady now. He'd been performing terror the same way Miller had been performing protection. Both of them actors, both of them waiting for the final scene. Julian said he'd known about Garrick's fake escape because he'd fabricated it himself. He'd used his prosecutor's access to file false reports, to create radio traffic, to forge the note in Garrick's cell, all of it designed to make Miller believe his plan was proceeding, to make Miller rush Julian here, to make Miller reveal the facility, demonstrate the vault, confess. Miller's face had gone white. Julian asked if Miller wanted to know why Julian had spent 11 months on this, why he'd manipulated Miller into this moment. Miller didn't answer. Julian told him anyway. Garrett Lowry had been Julian's younger brother. Half-brother, technically. Different fathers. Lowry had used their mother's maiden name professionally. But he'd been Julian's brother. 28 years old, investment analyst, engaged. Disappeared from a grocery store parking lot 11 years ago. Julian had been 39 then. A junior prosecutor. Ambitious. Focused on career advancement. Before law school, he'd done 6 years with Defense Intelligence Agency. Analyst work. Nothing glamorous, but it had taught him how classified projects got buried and who could make records disappear. Too busy after leaving DIA to visit Lowry often. Too busy to notice when Lowry stopped returning calls for a week. 2 weeks. By the time Julian had filed the missing persons report, Lowry had been gone 37 days. The investigation had gone nowhere. No leads, no evidence, no body. Lowry had been erased so completely that, after 5 years, the case was archived as a cold file. Julian had never stopped looking. Through law school debt and 70-hour work weeks and failed relationships, he'd kept Lowry's case file in his desk drawer. He'd reviewed it every week, looking for something, anything. And then the oubliette cases had started. And Julian had recognized the methodology, the complete erasure. The way victims vanished so thoroughly their families were left with nothing but silence. He'd known Lowry was one of them, even before Miller found Garrick, even before the trial. And when Julian had reviewed the original Lowry case files and found Miller's name on the responding officer report, he'd understood. Julian had spent the next year ensuring Garrick was convicted. Because he'd needed the case closed. Needed Miller to relax. Needed Miller to believe he was safe. So Miller would build his masterpiece, his final oubliette, and bring Julian to it. Miller was shaking his head, saying this was impossible. Julian couldn't have modified the vault. The contractors would have noticed. The systems would have failed testing. Julian explained patiently. He'd hired his own contractor, former military, specialized in high-security installations. The man had entered the facility at night, modified the hydraulic controls, installed the biometric lock, replaced the keypad housing with an identical unit. Perfect forgery. Miller's testing had showed normal function because the vault would still open to the correct code, as long as Julian's thumbprint was also present. But now Julian was outside the vault, and Miller was in the corridor, and Julian had no intention of providing his thumbprint. Miller lunged, fast, trained reflexes. He grabbed Julian's wrist, forcing Julian's hand toward the hydraulic panel. Julian drove his knee into Miller's stomach. Miller doubled over. Julian twisted free and ran. He made it to the kitchenette, grabbed the paring knife from the drawer. Miller tackled him from behind. They went down hard on the concrete floor. The knife skittered away. Miller pinned Julian's arms, his weight crushing, his face inches from Julian's. Miller hissed that Julian would open the vault. He'd use his thumbprint, or Miller would break every bone in Julian's hands until he complied. Julian smiled. He said Miller still didn't understand. The vault had been modified months ago, but the rest of the facility had been modified too. The main entrance, the biometric scanner, the communications uplink, all locked to Julian's biometric signature, all requiring his living thumbprint to operate. Miller couldn't leave. The entrance was sealed. The communications were severed. The facility was off-grid and unregistered. No one knew they were here except Julian's contractor, who had instructions not to check on the site for 6 months. Miller's expression changed. Understanding dawning. Horror. Julian explained the rest. The ranger station above was scheduled for demolition. But Julian had moved the demolition date. It wasn't 6 weeks away. It was 6 days away. In less than a week, explosives would collapse the ranger station. Rubble would bury the entrance. The land would be sold to a conservation trust. Permanently protected wilderness. No development, no excavation. This facility would become a tomb, buried and forgotten. Miller tried to haul Julian upright, drag him to the entrance scanner, force him to open it. Julian went limp, dead weight. Miller couldn't lift him and maintain control of his hands simultaneously. Miller released him and ran to the entrance himself, started trying to force the door, putting his shoulder against it, then kicking it, then looking for manual release mechanisms that didn't exist. Julian stood, collected the paring knife, walked to the vault. He knelt at the hydraulic panel, placed his thumb on the scanner, entered the 8-digit code. The hydraulics engaged. Julian turned the wheel lock through the sequence Miller had used. Right, left, left, right. The vault door unsealed. Julian pulled it open. The fluorescent lights were still on inside. The cot, the camp toilet, the shelf of supplies. He turned to Miller. Miller was standing at the entrance, both hands pressed against the steel door, as if he could force it open through will alone. He turned when he heard the vault unsealing. Julian stepped aside, left the vault door standing open. He said Miller had a choice. He could stay in the main facility and die when the demolition buried the entrance, crushed under rubble, suffocating slowly. Or he could enter the vault, the soundproof, airtight cell Miller had designed as his masterpiece, Water and food for months. Climate controlled. Safe from the demolition. A perfect oubliette. Miller stared at him. Julian said he'd give Miller 60 seconds to decide. Then Julian would seal whichever door Miller wasn't behind. Miller ran at him. Full sprint. Arms outstretched. Julian stepped into the vault. Miller tried to follow him through the doorway. Julian pressed his thumb to an interior panel Miller hadn't known existed. Another biometric lock. The vault door swung shut on pneumatic actuators, moving fast. The edge caught Miller's shoulder, threw him backward into the corridor. The door sealed with a pneumatic hiss. Julian stood inside the vault in absolute silence. The soundproofing was perfect. He couldn't hear Miller outside, couldn't hear anything except his own breathing. He waited 10 seconds, then pressed his thumb to the interior panel again. The door unsealed. Julian pushed it open. Miller was on the floor of the corridor, shoulder dislocated from the impact, face gray with pain. Julian looked down at him. He said Miller had 43 seconds left. Miller tried to stand. The dislocated shoulder made it impossible. He got to his knees, started crawling toward the entrance. Julian watched, counted silently. At 30 seconds, Miller gave up on the entrance. He turned and started crawling toward the living quarters, trying to put distance between himself and the vault. Julian said 20 seconds. Miller changed direction, crawled toward the communications room, trying to hide, trying to find somewhere Julian couldn't seal him inside. 10 seconds. Miller pulled himself upright using the wall. He looked at Julian. His eyes showed everything Julian had spent 11 years imagining. The understanding of what was coming. The absolute helplessness. Zero. Julian pointed at the vault. Miller's legs gave out. He sank to the floor. Julian walked to him, gripped Miller's good arm, started dragging him toward the vault. Miller fought, tried to resist. But the dislocated shoulder and the shock had weakened him. Julian was stronger than he looked. 11 years of contained rage made him stronger. He hauled Miller across the threshold into the vault. Miller's heels scraped concrete. He tried to grab the door frame. Julian kicked his hand away. Julian stepped back into the corridor. Miller lunged for the doorway. Julian pressed his thumb to the hydraulic panel. The door swung shut. It caught Miller's reaching hand. Miller screamed. The sound cut off abruptly as the door sealed. Complete silence. Julian stood in the corridor, breathing hard. His hands were shaking now. He'd held them steady for 14 months. He could afford to shake now. He walked to the communications room, retrieved his audio recorder from his jacket pocket, stopped the recording. 14 hours of audio. Miller's confession. Everything. He'd copied the recording to multiple redundant storage devices months ago. Cloud servers, encrypted drives, and safety deposit boxes. But he'd needed the original. The unbroken chain of custody. Prosecutor's habits. He pocketed the recorder and walked back to the vault door. Pressed his ear against the steel, listened. Nothing. The soundproofing was perfect. Miller could be screaming, crying, sitting in silence. Julian would never know. Julian checked his watch. 4:49 p.m. He walked to the main entrance, examined the sealed biometric scanner one final time. Then he knelt and opened a panel in the floor Julian had installed himself 3 months ago. Behind it, a narrow service tunnel, 4 feet in diameter, 70 yards long, ascending at a 15-degree angle. It led to a drainage culvert half a mile from the ranger station, well beyond the demolition radius. A rental car waited there, parked in heavy brush, invisible from the access road. Julian had crawled through this tunnel twice during construction to ensure it was undetectable. Once to install it, once to test it. He'd planned to crawl through it a third time today, but now he hesitated. He looked back down the corridor. The vault door. the sealed facility. Miller trapped inside his own masterpiece. Julian thought about Garrett Lowry, 28 years old. Groceries melting in his car. Disappeared so completely that for 11 years he'd been nothing but a case file. A photograph. A voice on a birthday message Julian still had saved on a phone he'd never erased. He thought about the other 13 victims, the families, the silence they'd been left with. He thought about Miller in the vault. How long the food and water would last. How long a human being could survive in absolute silence. Whether Miller would ration carefully or consume everything in the first few days. Whether he'd go mad before he died or remain lucid to the end. Julian didn't know. He'd never know. That was the point. He turned away from the corridor, climbed into the service tunnel. The space was tight. He had to crawl on his stomach using his elbows to drag himself forward. Behind him, the panel closed automatically, locked from inside, indistinguishable from the surrounding floor. Julian crawled. Concrete rough against his jacket, his breathing loud in the enclosed space. After 30 yards, he stopped, listened. Nothing. Just his own pulse. He started crawling again. At 50 yards, his flashlight caught something on the tunnel wall, scratched into the concrete with a nail or a piece of metal. Garrett Lowry's initials. Julian had carved them there 3 months ago, a marker, a reminder of why he was doing this. He touched the letters briefly, then kept crawling. The tunnel exit was covered by a steel grate. Julian pushed it open. Evening light flooded in. The sudden brightness after hours underground made him squint. He pulled himself out into the drainage culvert, stood, brushed concrete dust from his jacket. The culvert ran downhill through dense woods. No paths, no signs of human presence. Julian followed it to where he'd parked the rental car. The car was where he'd left it, undisturbed. Keys in a magnetic case under the rear wheel well. Julian got in, started the engine, sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. His phone was in the glove compartment. He'd left it there 3 days ago. He turned it on. 47 missed calls, 33 voicemails, his office, his mother's nursing home, friends. He'd been missing for 14 hours. People would be worried. Julian composed a text message to his assistant. Said he'd been dealing with a family emergency. Would be out of contact for a few more days. Would explain when he returned. He sent the message, turned the phone off, put it back in the glove compartment. Then he drove, south toward the highway, away from Garrett County, away from the ranger station and the bunker buried beneath it. He drove for 2 hours before stopping at a gas station outside Hagerstown. Filled the tank. Bought coffee he didn't drink. He sat in the rental car in the parking lot and thought about Miller in the vault. Wondered if Miller had figured out yet that the vault's ventilation was controlled by a timer. That in 72 hours the airflow would stop. Not enough to suffocate immediately, just enough to make breathing difficult, to make the darkness feel heavier, to add one more layer of torture to the absolute silence. Julian had programmed that timer himself. He'd thought carefully about the interval. 72 hours would give Miller time to understand fully what had been done to him. Time to realize no rescue was coming. Time to experience what Garrett Lowry had experienced. What all 14 victims had experienced. Julian started the car again. Drove another hour. Crossed into Pennsylvania. By the time he reached Harrisburg, it was after midnight. He checked into a motel using cash. The kind of place that didn't ask questions. The clerk barely looked at him. The room smelled like industrial cleaner. Julian lay on the bed, fully clothed, stared at the ceiling. He thought he'd feel something. Relief, satisfaction, completion. Instead, he felt nothing, just empty, hollowed out. He closed his eyes, tried to sleep. But all he could see was the vault door, the perfect seal. the 8 inches of steel, the soundproofing that would swallow any scream. Miller in absolute darkness, absolute silence. Forever. Julian opened his eyes. In 6 days, the demolition would bury the ranger station. Rubble would bury the entrance. The land would transfer to the Conservation Trust. Within a year, forest growth would erase any trace that humans had been there. The facility would become legend, a rumor, something hikers might mention to each other when passing through that section of woods. Did you hear about the old government bunker out here? Supposed to be from the Cold War. No one knows exactly where. And Miller would still be in the vault, preserved, entombed, a secret buried so deep it would never surface. Julian had done that, had created something that would last longer than memory, longer than justice. He'd created an oubliette, perfect, inescapable, eternal, his brother's murderer, erased as completely as his brother had been. Julian turned onto his side, pulled the motel blanket over himself. He did sleep eventually, dreamless, silent. When he woke, sunlight was coming through the gaps in the curtains. His watch said 11:23 a.m. He showered, dressed, checked out of the motel, drove another 6 hours, crossed into New York, then Connecticut. By evening, he was in Massachusetts. He stopped at a shopping mall in Springfield, bought new clothes, changed in a public restroom, put his old clothes in a donation bin. He looked at himself in the restroom mirror, same face, same eyes. But something had changed, something fundamental. He looked like his brother had looked, in the last photo Julian had of him, taken 2 months before he disappeared. Garrett Lowry had been smiling in that photo, but his eyes had been somewhere else, looking at something beyond the camera, beyond the moment. Julian understood that look now. He left the mall, got back in the rental car. He drove until he reached the coast, Portland, Maine. He returned the rental car at the airport, took a taxi to a hotel downtown, checked in under his own name this time, used his credit card, re-established his digital presence. He called his assistant, apologized for the radio silence, explained that his mother had had a health scare. False alarm, but it had consumed his attention. He'd be back in the office Monday. His assistant said everyone had been worried. He sounded relieved. Julian assured him everything was fine now. Julian hung up, looked out his hotel window at the Atlantic. Gray water, gray sky, no horizon visible. He stayed in Portland for 3 days, walked along the waterfront, ate at restaurants, answered emails. On the 3rd day, the demolition was scheduled. Julian sat in his hotel room and watched the clock. 4 p.m. The ranger station would be collapsing. Charges placed carefully by contractors who believed they were clearing condemned infrastructure. The building would fall. Rubble would bury the entrance. Steel and concrete settling into earth. And beneath it all, Miller, in the vault. Still alive if he'd rationed the water. Still breathing if the ventilation hadn't failed yet. Feeling the ground shake. Hearing nothing because of the soundproofing. Knowing what it meant anyway. Understanding that the world above was being erased. That his tomb was being sealed. Julian checked his watch. It was done. He stood, left the hotel, walked to the waterfront. The air smelled like salt and diesel fuel. Gulls circled overhead. Fishing boats returning to harbor. Julian stood at the water's edge until dark, then walked back to his hotel. The next morning he flew back to Baltimore, returned to his apartment, to his job, to his life. People asked about his mother. He said she was doing better. They asked if he was okay. He said he was fine. He returned to court, prosecuted cases, won most of them, lost a few. The rhythm of his life resumed as though it had never stopped. But sometimes at night, he'd wake up and think about the vault, the perfect silence, the absolute darkness. He'd wonder if Miller was still alive, if the water had run out yet, if the air was still circulating. He'd wonder if Miller screamed, if he tried to claw through the steel, if he'd gone mad or stayed lucid. He'd never know. That was the point. Some questions weren't meant to have answers. Some silences were meant to last forever. Julian would lie awake in his expensive sheets and listen to the sounds of his building, neighbors walking overhead, traffic outside, the hum of his refrigerator, all the sounds that proved he was alive. That proved he existed. That proved he wasn't buried in darkness, entombed in silence, erased from the world. He'd close his eyes eventually, fall back asleep, and dream of nothing at all. Brennan Forbes woke to the smell of aviation fuel in his own blood, and his first coherent thought was that Arthur had somehow survived. The Cessna's cabin had compressed like an accordion. The pilot, Brennan couldn't remember his name, had never bothered learning it, hung motionless in the front seat, neck bent at an angle that suggested his spine had separated somewhere around the third vertebra. Brennan's left shoulder screamed when he moved, but he could wiggle his fingers, rotate his wrist. Fractured clavicle, maybe. Dislocated at worst. He'd worked through worse hangovers. Arthur sat 3 feet away in the rear-facing jump seat, blinking slowly, a thin line of blood trailing from his hairline down past his ear. He looked like he was waking from a nap on the Long Island Railroad, mildly annoyed, faintly disoriented. His wire-rimmed glasses had survived unbroken. Brennan had spent the last 6 hours on that plane planning how to kill this man. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity. 30 minutes after takeoff, Brennan would have suggested they stretch their legs, move to the back to review the quarterly reports he'd prepared. Once Arthur was standing, once his seatbelt was off, Brennan would have opened the cabin door. At that altitude, the depressurization would have done most of the work. Arthur would have been pulled out into 18,000 feet of empty air before he could scream. Brennan would have claimed an equipment failure, a tragic malfunction with the door latch. The FAA investigators would have found nothing. Brennan had paid 3 different consultants to ensure the door mechanism could be triggered without leaving evidence. But they'd hit weather 12 minutes into the flight. The pilot had banked hard to avoid the storm cell, radioed that he was deviating from the flight plan to circumvent the worst of it. Then something wind shear, a microburst. Brennan didn't care about the technical details, had driven them down into the canopy so fast that Brennan's last memory before impact was the certainty that he was about to die without ever seeing Arthur's embezzlement scheme exposed. The deviation would matter later. Would mean search and rescue teams wouldn't know exactly where to look. Would mean days of searching the wrong grid squares while Brennan and Arthur sat undetected beneath the jungle canopy. Except it wasn't Arthur's embezzlement. It was his. Brennan had spent 9 years systematically routing company funds through shell corporations, phantom consultancies, offshore accounts structured like Russian nesting dolls. He'd stolen $42 million, and he'd done it so perfectly that the board had promoted him twice during the act of theft. Then Arthur, quiet, dowdy, 63-year-old Arthur, who wore the same rotation of 5 ties and brought egg salad sandwiches in Tupperware, had found the seam in the wall. Arthur had requested the private meeting 3 days ago. Brennan had expected the usual nervous rambling about pension fund allocations or healthcare premium increases. Instead, Arthur had placed a single flash drive on Brennan's desk and said he'd found irregularities in the Cayman accounts. He'd used that word, irregularities, like he was discussing a minor bookkeeping error. Brennan remembered thinking how satisfying it would be to watch this man disappear. Arthur, who'd sat through 9 years of board meetings with that same placid expression, while Brennan publicly shredded his proposals, who'd never once pushed back when Brennan reassigned his projects to younger analysts, who'd accepted every humiliation with a soft, "I understand," and returned to his spreadsheets. The man was a cipher, a non-entity. His elimination would be a footnote. Brennan had smiled, told Arthur he appreciated the diligence, suggested they fly down to the offshore branch office together to review the records in person. Arthur had agreed immediately, gratefully. Brennan had chartered the plane that afternoon. Now Brennan unbuckled himself, moved carefully around the pilot's body, and pushed open the crumpled door. They'd crashed in dense jungle, the kind of green that swallowed sound and light, where every surface dripped with moisture and rot. No roads, no clearings, no sign of civilization in any direction. Arthur's voice came from behind him, thin and reedy, asking if he was hurt. Brennan didn't turn around. He said his shoulder was damaged, asked about Arthur's condition in return. Arthur thought he was all right, then asked about the pilot with the kind of tentative concern that made Brennan want to put his fist through something. Brennan told him the pilot was dead, told him not to touch the body. Simple facts, no comfort offered. He scanned the tree line, calculating. The ELT, the emergency locator transmitter. Should have activated on impact, but he could see the device's housing shattered against the bulkhead. Circuits exposed like broken teeth. The fuselage had gouged a trench through 50 yards of vegetation before stopping against a massive strangler fig. The wings had sheared off somewhere behind them. Small mercies, no fire. The fuel tanks had ruptured on impact, but the jungle's humidity had prevented ignition. Arthur had climbed out of the wreckage, was standing in the torn earth like a man surveying a garden that had gotten slightly out of hand. He started talking about assessing supplies, water, first aid, any survival gear they could salvage. Brennan cut him off. He knew what they needed. He moved to the cargo compartment, forced open the bent door. The emergency kit had survived. Water purification tablets, protein bars, a first aid pack, 2 emergency blankets, a signal mirror, 3 road flares. Someone had done their job correctly. Brennan pulled everything out, began taking inventory with the same precision he used for earnings reports. Arthur watched him work, hands fluttering uselessly near his sides. He asked if they should move the pilot's body. It didn't seem right leaving him like that. Brennan told him moving a corpse wouldn't make it less of a corpse. He told Arthur to stop thinking and start gathering wood. They needed a fire. Arthur nodded, stumbled toward the jungle's edge, then stopped. He wanted to know if they'd be rescued. Brennan explained that the transmitter was destroyed. Unless Arthur had a working satellite phone in his pocket, they'd have to do this the old-fashioned way. Signal fire. Big enough to see from the air. He estimated 24 to 48 hours, depending on weather, flight path deviations, search grid efficiency. He peeled back his shirt, examined his shoulder in the dimming light. Swollen, angry purple spreading across the clavicle. He'd need to immobilize it. He told Arthur to get wood, dry if possible. They had maybe 90 minutes of daylight left. Arthur shuffled into the jungle, and Brennan allowed himself 60 seconds to close his eyes and think. The crash changed everything. The flash drive. Arthur had mentioned keeping a backup, but Brennan had assumed it was locked in Arthur's home office safe, easily retrievable after the body was processed and the estate settled. But if Arthur had brought the backup with him, if it had survived the crash, Brennan searched Arthur's carry-on, found it wedged in the torn lining. A waterproof case containing a second drive, along with Arthur's reading glasses, a bottle of antacids, and a small leather notebook filled with meticulous handwriting. Tiny, perfectly aligned columns of numbers and dates, 9 years of observations. He pocketed the drive. Arthur returned 40 minutes later with an armful of damp branches and a gash across his forearm where something had caught him. Brennan dressed the wound without comment, then built a fire using bark shavings and a method he'd learned at a corporate wilderness retreat in Montana. The kind of team-building exercise where junior associates pretended to enjoy sleeping in tents. They ate protein bars in silence as darkness settled over the jungle. The canopy blocked most of the moonlight. The fire created a small bubble of visibility, beyond which the world became solid black, punctuated by sounds Brennan couldn't identify. Clicking insects, distant howls, something heavy moving through underbrush. Brennan suggested they take shifts. Keep the fire going, 4 hours on, 4 off. Arthur said he'd take first watch. He didn't think he could sleep anyway. Brennan studied him. Arthur looked exactly like what he was, a 63-year-old accountant who'd spent his entire career in climate-controlled offices, whose idea of outdoor recreation was probably pruning rose bushes in his backyard. He had no business surviving out here. Without Brennan, he'd be dead in 36 hours, which meant Brennan needed Arthur alive, for now. Someone to gather wood, maintain the fire, purify water, while Brennan managed the actual strategy of survival and rescue. Once they were found, once they were back in cell phone range, Brennan could deal with the flash drive problem permanently. Brennan told Arthur to wake him in 4 hours. Don't let the fire die. Arthur promised he wouldn't. Brennan lay down on one of the emergency blankets, positioned himself so he could see Arthur in his peripheral vision. He closed his eyes but didn't sleep. He listened to Arthur's breathing, the crackle of burning wood, the jungle's infinite, chittering chorus. He mentally reviewed the Shell Corporation structure, identifying which accounts could be purged before Arthur's backup evidence reached anyone who mattered. The board trusted Brennan. Arthur was a subordinate, a functionary. If it came down to credibility, Brennan would win. But only if he was alive to make the case. Sometime around midnight, Brennan had lost his watch in the crash. He heard Arthur stand, walk a few steps away from the fire, then return. Normal, probably urinating. Brennan kept his breathing steady, eyes closed. Then Arthur's footsteps moved away again. But this time they didn't stop at the jungle's edge. They kept going, receding into the darkness with a purposeful rhythm that made Brennan's eyes snap open. Arthur was walking into the jungle, not wandering, walking, like he knew where he was going. Brennan sat up slowly, watched the firelight catch the last glimpse of Arthur's white shirt before the forest swallowed him completely. He considered following, but his shoulders screamed when he tried to stand quickly, and by the time he'd maneuvered himself upright, Arthur had been gone for 2 full minutes. The jungle at night was suicide. Brennan had no flashlight, no machete, no way to track someone through vegetation so dense that moving 10 feet might take 5 minutes of cutting and crawling. So he waited. Arthur returned 90 minutes later, stepping back into the firelight like he'd never left. His shirt was damp with sweat, his breathing elevated. He didn't look at Brennan, didn't seem to notice. Brennan was awake. Brennan asked where he'd gone, kept his voice neutral. Arthur, startled, turned. He said he'd needed to relieve himself, didn't want to do it near camp. Brennan asked if that usually took 90 minutes. Arthur claimed he'd gotten turned around, couldn't find his way back for a while. The jungle was disorienting in the dark. His hands were shaking when he said it. Brennan told him to sit down. Arthur sat. He stared into the fire, jaw working like he was chewing something. Brennan watched him for another hour, but Arthur didn't move again. Eventually, Brennan allowed himself to slip into something approximating sleep, though part of his mind stayed alert, tracking Arthur's presence by sound and firelight. When dawn broke, Brennan woke to find their water supply dumped across the sand. All 4 bottles they'd filled the night before, purified, carefully rationed, lay on their sides, empty. The water had soaked into the ground, leaving dark stains that were already beginning to dry in the early heat. Brennan stood, ignoring the spike of pain through his shoulder. He demanded to know what happened. Arthur crouched beside the bottles, face slack with confusion. He didn't know. He must have knocked them over when He didn't remember. He'd fallen asleep. He was supposed to be watching, but... He looked up at Brennan, eyes red-rimmed. Apologized, said he'd gather more. They could boil it. There was a stream about 100 yards east. Brennan repeated the words back to him. "You saw a stream," Arthur confirmed. "Yes, when he'd gotten lost last night. He'd seen water." Brennan said nothing. He counted to 10, then 20. Getting angry would burn calories they couldn't spare. He told Arthur to show him. Arthur led him through the undergrowth to a narrow creek, barely 6 inches deep, but running clear over smooth stones. They filled the bottles, dropped in purification tablets, returned to camp without speaking. Brennan spent the morning constructing a signal. He used the emergency blankets to create a reflective surface, positioned it in a small clearing where any aerial search would have a chance of spotting it. He built the fire higher, adding green leaves to create smoke. Arthur helped, moving with the careful obedience of someone trying to prove they weren't completely useless. By midday, the temperature had climbed into the 90s. The humidity made breathing feel like drowning. Brennan's shoulder had swollen to the point where he couldn't raise his left arm above the chest height. Arthur had developed a cough, wet, persistent, the kind that suggested fluid in the lungs. They ate another protein bar each, drank half a bottle of water. Brennan calculated. 6 bars left, assuming nothing else went wrong. 3 days, maybe 4 if they rationed carefully. Arthur suggested they explore, see if there was anything useful nearby. Fruit, maybe, or... Brennan cut him off. They stayed near the signal. If a plane passed, they needed to be here to activate the flares. Arthur tried to argue that if they didn't find food. Brennan reminded him they had food. Arthur said it would only last 3 days. Brennan said they'd be rescued in 3 days. Arthur looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he just nodded and returned to feeding the fire. That night, the protein bars disappeared. Brennan had stored them in the first aid kit, tucked inside the emergency supplies where they'd be protected from moisture and insects. When he opened the kit after sunset, he found the foil wrappers, torn and empty, scattered across the ground like confetti. He called Arthur's name, just the name, nothing else. Arthur emerged from the tree line where he'd been gathering more wood. He saw the wrappers and his face went pale. He started to say something, stopped, started again. He claimed he hadn't. Brennan asked if Arthur had eaten 6 protein bars while he was supposed to be gathering firewood. Arthur's mouth opened and closed. He looked at the wrappers like they were evidence of a crime he couldn't remember committing. Then his eyes went wide, and he pointed at Brennan with a trembling finger. He said it was Brennan. Brennan must have done it. Brennan was trying to make him think. Brennan told him to stop, just stop. But Arthur kept going, voice climbing toward hysteria. He said Brennan was losing his mind. The dehydration, the head injury, something was making Brennan do things and then forget. First the water, now this. Arthur had read about it. Survival situations could cause. Brennan stepped close enough that Arthur flinched backward. He told Arthur very clearly that he hadn't touched the food. He'd been in sight of the camp all day. Arthur was the one who kept disappearing into the jungle. Arthur was the one acting strange. Arthur's breathing had gone ragged. He insisted he didn't eat them. He wouldn't. He wasn't. Brennan asked what he was doing in the jungle for 90 minutes last night. Arthur said he'd already explained. He got lost. Brennan asked what he was doing in the jungle just now when the food went missing. Arthur said he was gathering wood. Brennan had told him to gather wood. Brennan picked up one of the empty wrappers. The foil was torn in a specific way, pulled apart from the center, not open from the end. Brennan opened protein bars from the inn. Always had. It was more efficient. This was someone else's pattern. He showed Arthur the wrapper. Asked if this was how Arthur usually opened things. Arthur stared at it. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or fear. He said he couldn't remember. He couldn't remember opening them. He couldn't remember eating them. But he must have. There was no one else here. Brennan wanted to believe it was an act. Wanted to believe Arthur was playing some kind of psychological game. But Arthur's terror looked real. The confusion looked real. Which meant either Arthur was an exceptional performer or something else was happening. Or Arthur was losing his mind. Or Brennan was. Brennan turned away, walked to the edge of the firelight. His shoulder throbbed, his head ached. He tried to remember the exact sequence of events from the morning. He'd been working on the signal. Arthur had been where? Gathering wood. No, feeding the fire. No, Brennan couldn't quite pin it down. The heat was making everything soft around the edges. He told Arthur they were down to water and whatever they could forage. Arthur nodded, sat down hard in the sand like his legs had given out. They spent the next day searching the jungle for anything edible. Arthur found some kind of berry, small, red, clustered on a low shrub. Brennan made him wait while he tested one on his skin first, then on his tongue, then swallowed a single berry and waited an hour to see if he'd vomit or convulse. When nothing happened, they picked every berry they could find. It yielded maybe 2 handfuls. They split them evenly. The berries tasted like battery acid and left Brennan's mouth feeling furry, but his stomach stopped cramping for the first time in 18 hours. That night, Brennan didn't sleep. He sat with his back against a tree, watching Arthur across the fire. Arthur had insisted on taking watch again, but within an hour his head was nodding, chin dipping toward his chest. Brennan waited. At some point past midnight, Arthur stood. He walked to the edge of camp, stopped, looked back toward where Brennan sat. Brennan didn't move, didn't close his eyes, just watched. Arthur turned and walked into the jungle. Brennan counted to 60, then tried to stand. His shoulders screamed. The swelling had gotten worse. His entire left side was a mass of purple-black tissue that sent lightning bolts of pain through his ribs every time he moved. He managed to get upright, took 2 steps, and his vision whited out. When it cleared, Arthur was gone. The jungle had swallowed him completely. Brennan stood at the edge of camp, breathing through the pain, and understood that he couldn't follow. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. His body was breaking down faster than he'd admitted to himself. The shoulder wasn't healing. It was getting worse. The dehydration had progressed beyond what water could fix. He needed real medical attention, real food, real rest. But Arthur was out there, going somewhere, doing something. Brennan returned to the fire and sat down. He would have to trust what he couldn't verify, would have to build his understanding from fragments, from the evidence Arthur left behind. It was the not knowing that would eventually break him. He understood that now. Arthur had figured out that Brennan's real weakness wasn't physical. It was cognitive. Brennan needed to understand, to control, to know the full scope of every situation. And Arthur was systematically denying him that knowledge. Brennan sat down across from him. He considered confronting Arthur about what he'd seen, but what would he say? I followed you into the jungle and watched you have a conversation with nobody. Instead, he told Arthur he'd take the rest of the watch. Arthur should sleep. Arthur lay down without argument. Within minutes, he was breathing deeply, evenly. Brennan sat awake until dawn, running through scenarios in his mind. Option 1. Arthur was having a psychotic break. The stress, the dehydration, the head injury, any of those could trigger it, which meant Brennan was alone out here with someone who might become dangerous. might wander off and die, and might do any number of unpredictable things. Option 2, Arthur was faking it, pretending to lose his mind as cover for what? Sabotaging their supplies? But why? What possible advantage did that give him? Option 3, Brennan was the one losing his mind. The head injury had been worse than he thought. He was hallucinating, confabulating, misremembering. The dumped water, the missing food. Maybe he'd done those things himself, and his brain was constructing false narratives to explain the gaps, and none of the options were good. When Arthur woke the next morning, he seemed completely normal. He gathered wood, purified more water, helped Brennan add to the signal fire. He asked reasonable questions about their rescue timeline, made sensible observations about the weather. Brennan watched him carefully. They looked for signs of the man he'd seen ranting at shadows the night before, but there was nothing. Just Arthur being Arthur, mild, compliant, slightly nervous. By afternoon, Brennan began testing Arthur. Small things. He'd tell Arthur to gather wood from the north side of camp, then watch to see if Arthur actually went north or wandered off in some other direction. He'd place objects, the signal mirror, a water bottle, in specific locations, then check later to see if they'd moved. Everything stayed exactly where Brennan put it, which proved nothing except that Arthur was either completely innocent or exceptionally careful. On the third day, they heard the plane. Brennan was checking the signal fire when he caught the sound. A small engine, single prop, flying low. He grabbed the flare, ran to the clearing, fired it into the sky. The flare arced up, trailing red smoke, impossibly bright against the blue. The plane kept going, didn't bank, didn't circle back, just continued on its path until the sound faded completely. It was the fourth time. They'd heard search planes on days 1 and 2. Distant at first, then closer. Brennan had set off flares both times, but the jungle canopy was too dense, or the planes were searching the wrong coordinates, or both. This was the first plane they'd heard in over 24 hours. The search was moving to other grid squares, expanding outward from where the flight plan said they should have gone down. But they hadn't gone down on the flight plan. They'd deviated for weather, and the pilot hadn't had time to update their position before impact. Brennan stood in the clearing, the flare gun still raised. They'd been so close. The plane had been directly overhead. The pilot had to have seen the smoke from the fire, had to have seen the flare. Unless they were too far off the search grid. Unless the jungle canopy was too dense. Unless. Arthur had watched from the tree line. When Brennan turned to look at him, Arthur's expression was unreadable. Brennan asked if Arthur had seen it. Arthur nodded. Said maybe the next one would spot them. Brennan told him there might not be a next one. The search could be called off. They could run out of time. Arthur said they still had water. They could find more berries. They could last another week at least. Brennan wanted to scream. Wanted to grab Arthur by his collar and shake him until that mild, accepting expression cracked. But he didn't. He walked back to camp, sat down, and tried to think. 4 days. They'd been here 4 days. Brennan's shoulder had gone from purple to black. The swelling had spread down his arm. He couldn't lift anything with his left hand anymore. His ribs ached when he breathed. Arthur's cough had gotten worse. He spent half the night hacking up things Brennan tried not to look at. They were deteriorating. Both of them. That night, Brennan pretended to sleep but kept his eyes open, watching Arthur through his lashes. Arthur sat by the fire for hours, perfectly still. Then, around midnight, he stood and walked into the jungle. Brennan lay there, every muscle tensed, wanting desperately to follow, but knowing his body wouldn't make it 20 feet into that darkness. His shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat. His vision had started tunneling at the edges, a sign of severe dehydration that water purification tablets couldn't fix. He listened to Arthur's footsteps recede into the jungle and felt his paranoia crystallize into something harder, more certain. Arthur was going somewhere. Had been going there every night, and whatever Arthur was doing out there, he was coming back stronger while Brennan grew weaker. Brennan waited. An hour passed, then another. When Arthur finally returned, he moved differently, less hunched, less defeated. He sat by the fire, and his breathing was even, relaxed. Not the breathing of someone who'd been wandering lost through hostile jungle. The breathing of someone who'd just returned from comfort. Brennan said nothing. Just watched through slitted eyes as Arthur settled in. As Arthur's posture radiated a satisfaction that Brennan couldn't explain but could feel in his bones. The next morning, Brennan searched the perimeter while Arthur gathered wood. He found Arthur's tracks leading into the jungle, the same direction Arthur always went. Brennan followed them as far as his shoulder would allow, maybe 50 yards, before the pain forced him to stop. The tracks were purposeful. Arthur wasn't wandering. He was walking a path he knew. He waited until morning, until Arthur woke and stretched and began his normal routine of gathering wood and checking the water. Then Brennan told him they needed to talk. Arthur looked at him with those mild, confused eyes, asked what was wrong. Brennan asked where Arthur went last night. Arthur claimed he hadn't gone anywhere. He'd been asleep. Brennan said he'd watched Arthur walk into the jungle, watched him leave for over 2 hours. Arthur's expression didn't change. He said Brennan must have been dreaming. He'd been right there all night. He hadn't moved. Brennan stood, got close enough to smell Arthur's breath. Didn't smell like berries or stale water. It smelled clean, too clean for someone who'd been sleeping by a smoky fire. Arthur stepped back, asked Brennan if he was feeling all right. He looked feverish. Maybe he should rest, drink more water. Brennan asked why Arthur's breath smelled like toothpaste. The question landed like a stone. Arthur's eyes widened, just for a second before the mild confusion returned. He said he'd found some mint leaves, chewed them to help with the taste of the purified water. He could show Brennan where... Brennan told him to stop lying. Brennan grabbed Arthur's collar with his good hand, told him to stop lying. Arthur's eyes went wide, hands coming up in a placating gesture. He insisted he wasn't lying. He swore he hadn't left camp. Whatever Brennan thought he saw, Brennan shoved him backward. Arthur stumbled, caught himself against a tree. Something fell from his pocket. A granola bar wrapper. Different brand than the ones from the emergency kit, but definitely a granola bar. Fresh. The foil still shiny. They both stared at it. Brennan asked where it came from. Arthur looked at the wrapper like it had materialized out of nowhere. He said he didn't know. Brennan picked it up. The wrapper was completely intact except for the top, which had been torn open. He turned it over in his hands. There was printing on the back. A barcode, a company logo, a manufacture date. 3 months ago, which meant it couldn't have come from their emergency kit. Those bars were from a different brand, a different supplier. This was something else. Something Arthur had brought with him, or something Arthur had found. Brennan asked again where it came from. Arthur sat down hard in the dirt. He put his head in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red. He said he'd brought it with him in his carry-on. He'd hidden it after the crash. He was scared that if Brennan knew he had extra food, Brennan would take it. Brennan asked why he'd be scared of that. Arthur looked at him like the question was absurd, because of what Brennan was, what he'd always been. Arthur had worked for Brennan for 9 years. He knew exactly what Brennan was capable of. The words hung in the air between them. Brennan told Arthur to show him where the rest of the food was hidden. Arthur said there wasn't any more, just the one bar. He'd been saving it. Brennan didn't believe him. He tore through Arthur's belongings, found nothing. searched the surrounding area, found nothing. If Arthur had a cache, he'd hidden it well. They didn't speak for the rest of the day. Brennan sat by the fire watching Arthur move around camp and tried to figure out what game they were playing. Because it was a game now. Had been from the start, maybe. Arthur hiding food, pretending to be confused, wandering off at night to... what? Eat in private? Sabotage their supplies to make Brennan think he was going crazy? But why? The only answer that made sense was the one Brennan kept circling back to. Arthur knew what Brennan had planned. Knew Brennan had brought him on that plane to kill him. And now Arthur was playing his own game, trying to outlast Brennan, trying to drive Brennan insane before Brennan could finish what he'd started. The thought should have made Brennan angry. Instead, it made him cold, focused. If Arthur wanted to play, Brennan would play. And Brennan had spent his entire career playing games with men who thought they were smarter than him. Arthur wouldn't win this one. That night, Brennan made a show of falling asleep early. He lay down, closed his eyes, regulated his breathing into the deep, even rhythm of sleep. He waited. An hour passed. 2. Then Arthur stood, walked to the edge of camp, and disappeared into the jungle. Brennan gave him a 30-second head start, then followed. This time he was ready. He'd memorized the path from the previous nights, knew where to step to minimize noise. His shoulders still screamed with every movement, but he'd learned to work through it, to partition the pain into a separate space in his mind. Arthur moved through the jungle with the same purposeful stride. Brennan followed, staying far enough back that Arthur wouldn't hear him, close enough that he wouldn't lose the trail. 20 minutes in, Arthur stopped. Brennan crouched behind a thick stand of ferns, watching. Arthur stood at the base of a large tree, looking up into the canopy. Then he reached into a hollow in the trunk and pulled something out. Brennan couldn't see what it was from this distance, but he saw Arthur unwrap it, saw Arthur eat, saw Arthur drink from something that definitely wasn't one of their water bottles. When Arthur finished, he put everything back in the hollow, covered it with moss, and walked back toward camp. Brennan waited until Arthur was gone, then moved to the tree. He reached into the hollow, felt around, found a waterproof bag. Inside, 3 granola bars, a bottle of water, and a small LED flashlight. Brennan stared at them. His mind raced through possibilities. Arthur had brought these with him, had hidden them after the crash, had been sneaking out every night to eat while letting Brennan starve, or Arthur had found these, had discovered them somewhere in the jungle, had kept them hidden because he didn't trust Brennan. Either way, it meant Arthur was lying, had been lying from the start. Brennan took one of the granola bars, left the rest. He wanted Arthur to know someone had found his cache, wanted to see how Arthur would react. He returned to camp. Arthur was already back, lying by the fire with his eyes closed. Brennan sat down across from him, unwrapped the granola bar slowly, deliberately. The sound of the wrapper crinkling was loud in the quiet jungle. Arthur's eyes opened. He saw Brennan eating, saw the wrapper, and his face went completely blank. Brennan asked if Arthur wanted to explain. Arthur sat up slowly. He said he'd already explained. He'd hidden food because he was scared. Brennan asked why Arthur had water in his cache, water they were supposedly rationing. Arthur's mouth opened and closed. Then he said Brennan must have taken it from the camp supplies. Brennan told him to try again. Arthur's expression shifted. The mildness fell away like a mask, replaced by something harder. He asked what Brennan wanted him to say. Brennan wanted the truth. Arthur laughed. It was a sharp, bitter sound that Brennan had never heard from him before. He said the truth was that Brennan had brought him on that plane to kill him. The truth was that Arthur had known the entire time. The truth was that when the plane went down, Arthur saw an opportunity. Brennan went very still. He asked what kind of opportunity. Arthur stood. He was smaller than Brennan, older, weaker. But standing there in the firelight, he looked different, more solid, more certain. He said he saw an opportunity to let Brennan destroy himself. The words landed like stones in still water. Brennan asked what that meant. Arthur explained that he hadn't eaten their supplies, hadn't dumped the water, hadn't done any of the things Brennan thought he'd done. Those were all Brennan. Sleepwalking, most likely, or just forgetting. The head injury, the stress, the guilt. Brennan's mind was protecting him from things he couldn't face. Brennan told him that was insane. Arthur asked if it was more insane than Brennan, following him through the jungle every night, watching him eat granola bars, constructing elaborate theories about sabotage and psychological warfare. More insane than Brennan's paranoid conviction that a 63-year-old accountant was somehow orchestrating Brennan's mental breakdown. Brennan said Arthur had just admitted to hiding food. Arthur said he'd hidden food because Brennan was dangerous. Because Brennan had been planning to murder him. Because even now, trapped on an island starving, Brennan was still thinking about how to eliminate the only witness to his crimes. The statement hung in the air between them. Brennan told Arthur he was projecting. Arthur was the one hiding things, lying, disappearing at night. Arthur asked where he would go. Where could he possibly go? They were on an island, a small island. There was nowhere to hide, unless there was. The thought hit Brennan like cold water. Unless the island wasn't small. Unless there was somewhere Arthur was going every night. Somewhere with food, with water, with... He looked at Arthur's face, and something in Arthur's expression confirmed it. Brennan asked what Arthur had found. Arthur said he hadn't found anything. He'd been right here the whole time. But his eyes slid away when he said it. Just for a second. Just enough. Brennan stood. His shoulder screamed in protest, but he ignored it. He told Arthur to show him. Arthur said there was nothing to show. Brennan moved closer. Told Arthur that if he didn't show him, Brennan would follow him tomorrow night. And the night after that. And eventually, Brennan would find it himself. Arthur's jaw tightened. Then he said fine, he'd show Brennan. But Brennan wouldn't like what he found. They walked into the jungle, Arthur leading. Brennan followed, every sense alert. This could be a trap. Arthur could be leading him somewhere isolated, somewhere he could... What? Kill him? Arthur didn't have a weapon, didn't have the physical strength. But Brennan kept his guard up anyway. They walked for 30 minutes. Brennan tried to memorize the path, but in the darkness, everything looked the same. Massive trees, tangled undergrowth, the constant drip of moisture from the canopy overhead. Then Arthur stopped. He stood at the edge of a ridge, looking down. He gestured for Brennan to approach. Brennan moved to stand beside him, looked down into the valley below, and saw lights, not firelight, electric lights, maybe 50 of them, spread out in loose patterns. Buildings, low-rise, nothing elaborate. A swimming pool that glowed blue in the darkness. What looked like a restaurant pavilion with outdoor seating. A small marina with maybe a dozen slips. A resort. Not one of the mega properties you'd see in travel magazines. Something smaller, older. The kind of place that probably did decent business during high season, but looked half empty now. The pool glowed blue in the darkness, but the diving board had a faded closed. Do not use sign zip-tied to the ladder. That specific kind of deferred maintenance that marked off-season operations stretching into permanent neglect. Off-season, skeleton staff. Which would explain why no one had noticed the crash. They'd gone down on the far side of a densely forested ridge, the sound absorbed by vegetation and distance. Would explain why no one had spotted search planes overhead and connected the dots. The resort was operating on minimal staffing. Minimal awareness of anything beyond their immediate property line. Half a mile away. The whole time. Brennan stared. His brain couldn't process what he was seeing. They'd been stranded for 6 days. 6 days of starvation and dehydration and deterioration. 6 days of believing they were alone on an uninhabited island. And the entire time, there had been a luxury resort less than a mile away. He turned to look at Arthur. Arthur was watching him with an expression Brennan couldn't read. Brennan asked when Arthur had found this. Arthur said he'd found it the first night, when he'd gone to relieve himself and gotten lost. He'd walked over the ridge and seen the lights. Brennan asked why Arthur hadn't said anything. Arthur's smile was small, cold. He said he'd been waiting. Waiting for what? Brennan asked. Arthur said he'd been waiting to see how long it would take Brennan to break. How long it would take for the guilt and the paranoia and the starvation to crack that perfect executive shell and reveal what was underneath. Brennan's vision had narrowed to a single point. His hands felt numb. He asked if Arthur had been going down there. To the resort, Arthur confirmed, every night. He'd waited until the outdoor restaurant closed, usually around 10. The staff would clear the buffet, but leave the pavilion unlocked for early morning setup. Arthur would slip in around midnight, eat whatever hadn't been refrigerated yet, bread, fruit, sometimes cold cuts if he was lucky. There was a service bathroom he'd used to clean up. An outdoor shower by the pool he'd used once when he was sure no one was around. He'd been careful, had watched the patterns. The security guard made rounds every 2 hours, always the same route. The night manager left at 11. Housekeeping didn't start until 6. There was a gap. 7 hours where the resort was mostly empty, mostly dark, mostly unmonitored. Arthur said he'd learned that working hotels, night was when properties were most vulnerable. When people assumed everything was locked down, but really you just had one guard, one desk clerk, and a lot of trust that nothing would go wrong. Brennan asked why. Arthur's expression hardened. He said he'd wanted Brennan to suffer, wanted Brennan to experience what it felt like to be helpless, to be desperate, to watch everything slip away while someone who was supposed to help you stood by and did nothing. Brennan told him he was insane. Arthur said maybe, but not as insane as Brennan. Brennan was the one who'd spent 9 years stealing from the company. Brennan was the one who'd planned to murder his accountant. Brennan was the one who'd hired a plane and coordinated a mid-flight assassination. And now Brennan was the one standing on a ridge, starving and injured and half-mad with paranoia, while the person he'd tried to kill had been eating room-service burgers and sleeping in air-conditioned comfort. Arthur said it felt like justice. Brennan's hand moved before he'd made a conscious decision. He grabbed Arthur's collar, shoved him backward. Arthur stumbled, caught himself. Brennan moved toward him, and Arthur backed up, hands raised. Arthur said Brennan should think about what he was doing. They were 50 yards from a 5-star resort. There were people down there, witnesses. If Brennan heard him now, if Brennan finished what he'd started on the plane, there would be evidence. Cameras, security, no way to cover it up. Brennan stopped. Arthur was right. Killing him now would be suicide. But Brennan could go down there. Could tell the resort staff what Arthur had done. Could explain that Arthur had deliberately withheld information about their location, had sabotaged their supplies, had psychologically tortured a crash survivor. Except who would believe him? Brennan looked down at himself. He was filthy, starving, injured. He'd been ranting about sabotage and psychological warfare for days. He'd been following Arthur through the jungle at night, accusing him of moving supplies around, of having conversations with people who didn't exist. If Brennan walked into that resort right now and started making accusations, he'd sound like a madman. Brennan asked how long Arthur was planning to let this go on. Arthur said he'd been planning to wait one more week, let Brennan deteriorate a bit more, make sure the psychological damage was permanent. Then Arthur was going to discover the resort and play the hero, the traumatized survivor who'd kept his colleague alive through sheer determination and courage. Brennan asked what would happen to him. Arthur said Brennan would be taken to a hospital, diagnosed with severe survivor's delirium, probably transferred to a psychiatric facility for evaluation. And while Brennan was being treated for his psychotic break, Arthur would return home, would turn over the flash drive with all the evidence of Brennan's embezzlement, would testify before the board, would take over the company. Brennan said no one would believe him. Arthur asked who the board would trust more, the loyal accountant who'd worked there for 9 years, or the executive who was currently committed to a psychiatric ward, raving about torture and sabotage. Brennan had no answer. Arthur told him they should go down to the resort now, get Brennan some help. It was the humane thing to do. He turned and started walking down the slope toward the lights. Brennan stood alone on the ridge, watching Arthur descend. His mind was moving through possibilities, through exits, through any scenario where he came out of this with his life intact. There were none. If he went down there now, Arthur's version would be the official story. Brennan would be the executive who'd had a mental breakdown after a plane crash. His accusations against Arthur would be dismissed as delusions. The embezzlement evidence would come out. He'd lose everything. If he ran, disappeared into the jungle, he'd die out here, or be found eventually in even worse condition, which would only confirm Arthur's narrative. If he killed Arthur now, here, he'd be caught. There were cameras down there, security. He'd be arrested for murder. Every path led to the same place, complete and total destruction. Arthur had won. Brennan started down the slope after him. His legs felt disconnected from his body. His shoulder throbbed with every step. The lights below grew brighter, closer. He could hear music now, and something soft and tropical playing from outdoor speakers. Could smell chlorine from the pool and grilling meat from the restaurant. They walked onto a manicured lawn. The grass was impossibly green, recently mowed. A sprinkler system was running, creating small rainbows in the outdoor lighting. Arthur led him toward the main building, a sprawling structure with white columns and wide verandas. People moved inside, visible through the windows, couples in resort wear, families, normal people on vacation. Brennan felt like he'd stepped through a portal into another dimension. A security guard saw them approaching. He immediately radioed for backup, his hand moving toward the weapon at his belt. Brennan realized how they must look. 2 men emerging from the jungle, filthy and injured and wild-eyed. Arthur raised his hands in a peaceful gesture, started explaining. They'd been in a plane crash 6 days ago, just on the other side of the ridge. They needed help. The guard called for paramedics, for his supervisor. Within minutes, they were surrounded by resort staff, by emergency personnel. Someone wrapped a blanket around Brennan's shoulders. Someone else was checking his vitals, shining a light in his eyes, asking him questions he couldn't quite process. Brennan tried to speak, tried to explain that Arthur had known about the resort, had been coming here every night, had been deliberately torturing him. But the words came out wrong, jumbled. He couldn't make his thoughts linear. The paramedic kept telling him to calm down, kept saying he was in shock, kept promising they'd get him to a hospital. Arthur sat on a nearby bench, wrapped in his own blanket, sipping water someone had brought him. He looked appropriately traumatized, shaken. When the police arrived and started asking questions, Arthur explained that they'd crashed 6 days ago, that he'd been keeping Brennan alive, trying to signal for help, that Brennan had been deteriorating over the last few days. Paranoid, delusional, aggressive. Arthur said it with such concern, such gentle worry. Brennan screamed that Arthur was lying, that Arthur had been sneaking here every night, that Arthur had hidden food, had moved their supplies, had been torturing him deliberately. The paramedics exchanged looks. One of them prepared a sedative. Brennan fought them. He didn't want to be sedated. He needed to make them understand. But his body was too weak, his mind too fractured. When the needle went in, he felt the familiar slide into sedated darkness. His last coherent thought before the sedative took him was that Arthur had planned this perfectly, every single piece. When Brennan woke, he was in a hospital room. White walls, fluorescent lights, the steady beep of monitors. His shoulder was properly immobilized now, wrapped in a professional brace. An IV ran to his arm. The room smelled like disinfectant and recycled air. A doctor came in, introduced herself, explained that he'd been severely dehydrated and malnourished, that he'd sustained multiple injuries in the crash, that he was going to be fine physically. Then she asked how he was feeling mentally. Brennan said he was fine, just tired. The doctor made a note on her tablet. She said the paramedics had reported some concerning behavior at the resort. Paranoia, delusions, aggression toward his colleague. Brennan told her he wasn't delusional. Told her Arthur had been going to the resort every night, had been hiding the fact that they were near civilization. The doctor's expression was professionally neutral. She said she understood Brennan had been through a trauma, that it was normal for the mind to create narratives, to process survival situations. Brennan insisted it wasn't a narrative. It was what happened. The doctor said they'd run some cognitive tests. Make sure there was no lasting damage from the head injury. In the meantime, he should rest. She left. Brennan lay in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, and understood with perfect clarity that no one was going to believe him. Arthur had created an unassailable story. The loyal employee who'd kept his boss alive through a nightmare, while the boss descended into madness from the stress. And Brennan had played his part perfectly, had ranted about torture and sabotage and midnight buffets, had attacked Arthur in front of witnesses, had needed to be sedated by paramedics. Every piece of evidence confirmed Arthur's narrative. 2 days later, a police detective came to interview him. She was professional, sympathetic. She explained that they were investigating the crash, trying to piece together what had happened. Brennan told his story, told her about the embezzlement, about Arthur finding the records, about Brennan's plan to kill Arthur on the plane. The detective wrote everything down. When Brennan finished, she asked if he understood what he'd just confessed to. Brennan said he understood. Said he wanted to add that Arthur had known about the resort from the first night, had deliberately let Brennan suffer. The detective asked if Brennan had any proof of that. Brennan said Arthur's own admission. Arthur had told him on the ridge above the resort. The detective said she'd spoken to Arthur. Arthur claimed Brennan had dragged him out of camp in the middle of the night, ranting about imaginary hotels and conspiracies. Arthur said he'd gone along with it to calm Brennan down, to prevent Brennan from hurting himself or wandering off into the jungle. Brennan asked if the detective had checked the resort's security footage. Arthur had been going there every night for 6 days. There had to be footage. The detective said they'd checked. The resort had cameras covering the main entrance, the front desk, the pool area during the day. But the outdoor pavilion, where Arthur claimed to have found food, no camera coverage. The owner had apparently decided it wasn't worth the cost. Off-season property, minimal security budget, low theft risk. The few cameras they did have showed nothing. No jungle man sneaking around. But the detective noted that the cameras had significant blind spots, someone who knew security systems, who understood camera angles and patrol patterns, could potentially avoid detection. She asked again if Arthur had any background in security or facilities management. Brennan went very still. He told her about Arthur's 8 years managing hotel properties before joining the company, about his responsibilities for security systems, staff scheduling, overnight operations. The detective made a note. She said that was interesting. Someone with that background would know exactly how to exploit an understaffed resort's vulnerabilities. But knowing how didn't prove he'd done it. She told Brennan that the district attorney's office would be reviewing his confession, that he should probably contact a lawyer, that he should focus on his recovery. She left. Brennan lay in the hospital bed, the full scope of Arthur's plan crystallizing in his mind. Arthur had timed it perfectly, had waited until the cameras were down to start his nightly visits, had kept Brennan in the jungle just long enough to ensure severe psychological deterioration, had orchestrated Brennan's confession in front of a police detective, had positioned himself as the hero while Brennan became the villain. On the third day, a psychiatrist came to evaluate him. She asked about his mental state, his perceptions of reality, his relationship with Arthur. Brennan told her everything. Told her about watching Arthur disappear into the jungle at night, about finding the hidden food, about Arthur's admission on the ridge. The psychiatrist listened without judgment. When Brennan finished, she asked if he understood how his story sounded. Brennan said it sounded insane. She asked if he believed it was true anyway. Brennan said he knew it was true. The psychiatrist made notes. She said she'd be recommending a full psychological evaluation. That given the severity of his trauma, both physical and psychological, it might be beneficial for Brennan to spend some time in a supervised facility. Brennan asked if that was voluntary. The psychiatrist said that depended on the results of the evaluation. She said that given Brennan's confession to planning a murder, combined with his current mental state, he was a danger to himself and others. She said the facility was very nice, comfortable. He'd receive excellent care. Brennan asked how long he'd be there. She said that depended on his progress. Weeks, maybe months. However long it took for him to accept reality, to let go of the paranoid narrative he'd constructed. Brennan understood what she was really saying. However long it took for him to stop insisting Arthur had tortured him. To admit that the torture had been self-inflicted, a delusion born from guilt and trauma. To become the story Arthur had written for him. On his last day in the hospital, they brought him medication. Antipsychotics, anti-anxiety drugs. They explained that these would help him process his trauma, would help him distinguish between reality and delusion. Brennan took the pills. He'd stopped fighting. There was no point. When the ambulance came to transfer him to the psychiatric facility, Arthur was there. He rode with Brennan, held his hand, spoke in soothing tones about recovery and healing and hope. Brennan looked at Arthur's face, that mild, forgettable face that had sat across from him in boardrooms for 9 years, and saw what no one else could see, the satisfaction. The cold, perfect satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly. Arthur had the flash drive in his pocket. Brennan could see the slight bulge in Arthur's jacket, the evidence of Brennan's embezzlement, ready to be delivered to the authorities with a grief-stricken explanation about how Arthur had discovered his boss's crimes, how he'd tried to confront Brennan, how the stress had caused Brennan's breakdown. Arthur caught Brennan looking. He smiled, small, private, just for Brennan. Then he patted Brennan's hand again and told him everything was going to be fine. Brennan closed his eyes. The medication was starting to work, making everything soft and distant. He could feel his thoughts slowing, his rage dampening, his certainty eroding. Soon he'd start to wonder if maybe he had been delusional, if maybe the torture had been in his head, if maybe Arthur really had been trying to save him. Soon he'd become the story Arthur had written, and Arthur would go back to the company, would present the evidence, would be hailed as a hero for uncovering the embezzlement, would step into Brennan's role, would run the company Brennan had spent 15 years building, would live the life Brennan had planned to live, while Brennan spent his days in a locked ward, screaming about luxury resorts and midnight buffets. The ambulance turned a corner. The hospital disappeared from view. Brennan opened his eyes one last time, looked at the psychiatric technician sitting across from him. Young woman, professional, already reading Brennan's file with the particular expression people get when they're reading about someone who's completely lost their mind. Brennan tried to speak, tried to explain one more time that Arthur had done this deliberately, that Arthur had tortured him, that Arthur had won. But the medication was too strong. The words came out slurred, incomprehensible. The technician made a note on her tablet and told him to rest. They'd be there soon. Everything would be fine. Brennan felt the darkness rising, felt the medication pulling him under. His last coherent thought was Arthur's face, smiling that small, private smile. The smile of someone who'd turned a plane crash into a perfectly executed murder that would never be prosecuted. Because the victim was still alive. He just didn't exist anymore.